If you ask high schoolers in the US whether they have felt sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 weeks or more in a row, 40% say yes, including 53% of the girls. And some people are ready to blame social media.
No social media until 16.
Jonathan Haidt's book,
The Anxious Generation.
How the great rewiring of childhood is causing an epidemic of mental illness. I don't think anybody can dispute that.
But plenty of experts actually do dispute that.
Why do you think the majority of social scientists actually working in this field disagree with you on this?
Well, first of all,
to understand the controversy around this question, we decided to have our own debate. We flipped a coin to pick sides.
Oh.
Okay.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay.
All right.
And armed ourselves with evidence to trade statistics, answer tough questions, and even concede a point. Today, we switch from collaborators to adversaries.
One thing I'm noticing, you guys are sometimes nodding at each other's points because you're often quite collaborative. Be more combative.
Stop doing that. In this new podcast-like format, we take on the fiercest debate in psychology.
Get ready for a Howtown showdown. They're facing off with facts so that you get the lowdown.
We partnered with Riverside to make this episode.
So funny thing, I'm traveling and my internet just went out, but you at home have no idea that that happened because we're recording this with Riverside, which is an all-in-one online studio.
It's not just a tool for YouTubers. You've probably noticed that all kinds of people across tech, design, business are using video and audio to really promote their personal brands and reputations.
Yeah, the problem is a lot of people just assume that they need all of this stuff to be able to make content. You know, you think you need gear or a studio or you need all these editing skills. But these days, and this is pretty recent, because of tools like Riverside, that's just not true anymore. So with Riverside, you can record on your laptop or your phone, you hit record, and what it does that is super useful is that it records like both of our sides of the conversation locally on our device. So it's recording on Adam's computer, it's recording on my computer, and that means that if our Wi-Fi is spotty, the recording still comes out very clean and crispy.
Then with just a single click, Riverside automatically turns your recordings into short clips for LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram. So if you've ever thought about sharing your expertise, teaching what you know, gaining influence in your industry, Riverside is a great way to make sure your voice is heard.
And right now you can get 10% off a Riverside subscription with access to all of their tools if you click the link in our description and you use the code HOWTOWN. If you think you might want to try this out, and we genuinely recommend this tool, we use it a lot, using our code can really help our channel.
So Joss will be arguing for the proposition that social media is harming teens' mental health, and Adam will be arguing against. This sound is the timer, and this sound is for when we have a visual on screen for you if you want to see it. There'll be 7 rounds, and at the end you can vote for which side won on Patreon.
Showdown, first round.
You'll have 2 minutes to present your opening arguments. Joss is up first.
Okay, so when we say that there is a mental health crisis among Gen Z, we are relying on multiple different lines of evidence. So these are robust, sort of long-term data sources that show steep changes starting in the mid-2010s, which is when a very small number of American tech companies started experimenting with all of our minds. So these are surveys that are conducted inside schools or by interviewers that actually visit houses, and they are showing increases in the percentage of teenagers who have had a major depressive episode in the past year, the percentage who say they often feel lonely, who say they do not enjoy life, that they experience persistent sadness and hopelessness, and the increases are especially sharp for girls. It's not just the survey data either. The rates of teen girls visiting ERs for self-harm have risen, hospitalizations for self-harm have risen, and most tragically, suicides are up for teens, for both boys and girls. And in the age range of 10 to 14, where suicide is thankfully quite rare, we're seeing rates that the US has never recorded before. Now you look at other parts of the world and you see similar trends to different degrees in Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and some parts of Europe as well. And in all of those places, the trends are worse for girls than boys. Now, I'm not saying that all of Gen Z is depressed or anxious, but we're talking about a growing number of kids who are falling into despair at the same time that Silicon Valley has completely remade the experience, the daily experience of being a teenager.
Okay, Adam, you now have 90 seconds to respond.
I don't think anyone would argue that we have seen some mental health changes in teens, especially in the United States. But if you want to tie that to social media, you've got to prove that it's as big and ubiquitous and global as social media is. So first off, is it as big as it seems? I think that there's been some changes in the last 10 years that may have inflated those numbers. You've got, first and foremost, a decrease in the stigma around mental health. People are talking about it more. There's been changes in the way we diagnose these conditions, and there's more mental health care. All those things are really good, but it just means that we're probably catching more people that have these issues. Second, is it new? We've had spikes in suicides before. In the 90s, the suicide rate for girls was actually just slightly lower than it is now. And for boys, it was actually higher back in the 90s. And is it global? We can look and see there's not great data from around the world, but there are places like the Netherlands where you do see huge uptake of social media. They were early adopters. We have great data there, and we don't see this pattern at all. And so if you want to link the mental health challenges we see here to social media, you've got to explain why we don't see that everywhere. But the most important thing is that even if these lines line up, correlation is not causation, and we need to prove that causation.
Wow, look at you hitting that timer. Like, nobody is saying that this is the only factor that would explain mental health outcomes or that would explain suicide, which is a complicated and really tragic outcome. But when you look at all these indicators together, you're seeing trends that are hard to deny. You know, there's one thing about doctors being more likely to diagnose anxiety and depression, but when a kid is answering a survey question of like, do you often feel lonely? I don't think that there's very strong evidence that the decline in stigma would increase those numbers. The fact that you're seeing this in many countries, I think, at least says that this is not something unique to the United States. And it's something about maybe the English-speaking countries, the more individualistic countries, are interacting with social media in this way that's harmful.
I think even if we can agree that there is an increase in mental health issues, I don't think that you're going to be able to show that there's strong, consistent, robust evidence linking social media. Not just as, I think maybe it could be a factor, but I don't think it's even in the top 5 factors at play. And I'm going to try and show that for the rest of this debate.
And before you start, I would just say that everyone should keep in mind that this is a very difficult thing to study.
Okay, let's move on to Adam's opening arguments. Adam, you have 2 minutes on the clock starting now.
Great. I want to just give a little bit of my time to sort of set up the scenario. So people saw this rise in mental health issues in the United States. They went looking for what could have caused it. They see, what's the youth doing these days? Oh, they're always on their phones. So they went looking for evidence that linked these two phenomena. And they produced hundreds and hundreds of studies, right, Josh? We kind of an overwhelming amount of studies, more than we were able to read. And they sort of fell into different categories. You could take a snapshot of a population with a survey. You can follow a cohort over time. You can set up an experiment where you randomly assign half the group to give up social media. And hundreds of these studies have been done. So what do they say? There's been dozens of reviews and meta-analyses that try to find the most robust studies and synthesize their results. And generally, they point out that the results are mixed. Sometimes they find a negative association. Sometimes they find a positive one. A lot of times they find a neutral association. But what most of these peer-reviewed reviews say is that there just isn't the connection between social media and this mental health crisis is weak and inconsistent. I'll quote from a National Academy of Sciences review that came out just last year. It was kind of a mega review of all the reviews that says, the committee's review of the literature did not support the conclusion that social media causes changes in adolescent health at the population level. Some people have sold a lot of books arguing the opposite, but a lot of people who work in this field are upset about that. They've said that Jonathan Haidt, for example, is telling stories that are unsupported by research. And the last thing I'd point out is that a lot of these reviews do point to other factors that could be influencing the mental health crisis.
Okay, and Joss, 90 seconds to respond.
Okay. It's really important to understand what this evidence base is doing, what the vast majority of these studies are doing, which is that they ask teens on surveys, how many hours do you spend on social media, as if we are good estimators of that. And then they look for correlations with mental health issues. There is no control group of kids that never got on social media. They all did. So we're looking for differences between kids who spent 2 hours a day and kids who said they spent 4 hours a day. And then they lump all of these apps together. So if you ask kids, the big time sucks, that would really show up when they report their time on their phones, are watching YouTube and TikTok videos that are mostly made by strangers. Now, I wouldn't necessarily call that social media. That's kind of just media today. And then they spend less time on apps like Snapchat and Instagram, but most kids are checking those every day. And I want to tell you 10 things that can happen within 15 minutes of checking Snapchat or Instagram. Okay, they didn't follow me back. They left me on red. The person I messaged the most isn't messaging me the most anymore. Yes, Snapchat has indicators for that. They didn't watch my story. I didn't get many likes on my post. I got a rude comment on my post. That other person got a lot of likes on their post. Someone I care about liked their post, but not mine. Look at the comments she got on her body, face, and clothes. My crush is in someone else's story, and my friends are hanging out without me. So whether you spend 4 hours online or 1, you're getting this relentless feedback, and the studies that you're citing are probably not set up to measure that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's true that a lot of the studies that are out there aren't that good quality. I totally agree with that. And some of it is that this is really hard to study, like you said, and it's hard to design an experiment that really gets at the question. But the lack of a good study doesn't magically provide evidence to the contrary that is linking these two things. And the sort of overwhelming nature of social media, which may be amplifying sort of those kind of stressors. It sort of looks a lot like what being a teenager was like before social media.
Oh, come on.
It's just to a more, it's louder and it's faster. But I'd also say that you mentioned, some of these things are comparing 2 and 4 hours. Some of them are comparing less than an hour and more than 6 hours. I mean, there are some pretty big extremes.
Well, and when you see those extremes, most of them certainly show that kids that are spending 4, 5, 6 hours a day do have worse mental outcomes.
They have worse mental health outcomes, but just a little bit worse. I want to talk more about that later, but I really think that it's, if it was causing a mental health crisis, if it was a big enough of a problem that it's driving these terrible outcomes that we see, wouldn't we be able to measure a bigger effect in some of these experiments, however flawed they are?
Well, you do have to narrow in on exactly that, what experiences are doing the damage, and you have to narrow in on which groups of these kids are most vulnerable. And so when you do slice this data and you look at girls, you're going to see bigger effects. And there are no studies that show that spending hours and hours on social media is good for mental health.
Okay, why don't we move on?
Okay.
Stat.
You each have 1 minute to present a stat that supports your case. And Adam, you're up first.
So my stat is 0.041 standard deviations. This kind of weird sounding number comes from a very recent paper that was, I think, very well designed. They asked thousands of people to quit Instagram for 6 weeks, and then they saw how it affected their emotional state. And they found that this, period of social media abstinence shifted the emotional state in the right direction, but only a tiny little bit, 0.041 standard deviations. For reference, in psychology, you typically want to have standard deviation shift of more than 0.2 to call it, something that's emerging from the statistical noise. And then you really want it to be over 0.4, so 10 times the effect that they saw, if you want to say this is clinically significant. This is going to affect people's lives in a way that they're going to need help.
Okay, Joss, your response?
Okay, a couple things about that study. It was on adults, so there's no teens in this sample. And if you look at the effect on young women, and they do this in the paper, they look at the slices of the groups, and the effect for young women on Instagram, and this is like 18 to 34 or something, was more than twice as large as the effect that you're saying. Even though, and this is also important, the study said that their participants didn't take that time that they had been spending on Instagram and go outside and play soccer with their friends. They're saying that they just substituted time on other apps of their phone, right? They closed Instagram, opened TikTok, and still they found an effect.
But
wait, I want to use my tag team here.
Tag team.
I interviewed the lead author of that study, the Stanford economist Hunt Alcott, and this is what he had to say.
One decision that we all make as individuals is, should I personally stop using social media? And I think the individual level randomized experiments that people have done speak to that question. But then you might want to stay on social media if all your friends are on social media. And then so another question is, what happens if everybody uses less at the same time? And school level policies to ban smartphones, at least during the school day, speak to that. And so that's the next frontier of research.
Boom.
Well, this doesn't, I don't quite see how this addresses what I said. I mean, he's talking about we need to have better studies in schools, that, this study addresses, like, would you choose whether or not to quit social media? It doesn't really address the fact that in his own paper, he says that the effects that they measured were not statistically significant, and they didn't rise to the level of significance that they set before they started the paper.
Except for in young women.
Well, even in young women, the size of the effect didn't hit that 0.2 threshold that's commonly used in this field.
And even if it hit that number, it still wouldn't be at the level that we see with something like trauma or abuse, where we know for sure that it's causing harms that we need to step in and do something about.
Right. We're talking about 6 weeks off of Instagram while everybody around you is still on and you're just using different apps. And they found an effect. And yes, it was small. But I think his point here is that it's a collective action problem. All the kids have shifted into this parallel universe. And now if any one of them abstains, they are isolated. So what you really need to do in order to study what this has done to childhood writ large is sort of randomize communities to spend less time and then see if you can find differences. And what he told me is that the research is going in that direction, and hopefully we'll start to see some of those results.
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate to bring up the school studies because there haven't been that many of them. But, because he brought it up, there have been a couple that have looked at this, and they also found, minuscule to zero effects. I think, I wouldn't hang my hat on that because I think there needs to be more studies, and I think it's good that those are being done. But still, so far, the evidence we have isn't pointing in the direction of massive effects, even when an entire school says no social media all day, every day, or while you're at school.
Well, while you're at school, right? If they go home and they spend 6 hours.
Right, which we can't control. Yeah, with an experiment like that.
Norms around parenting could change that.
Right. But it would be hard to make an experiment that successfully policed that, I think.
It would be hard.
We might move on.
Okay. Yeah, let's do that.
Joss, you get 1 minute to present your stat.
Okay, so 64% is the share of 11 and 12-year-olds in the U.S. who reported having social media accounts, 64%. And we're talking about sixth graders here. Now, this is notable for a couple of reasons. One being that the minimum age requirement for these apps just to sign up for an account is 13. So the kids are just lying to set up their account. The age gate is ineffective. Secondly, we have research showing that the negative effects of social media on mental health are worse for those younger adolescents. So this comes from a British sample. It's a really impressive study. And it showed that for 11, 12, 13-year-old girls, an increase in their social media use in 1 year predicted a decrease in their life satisfaction a year later. That was also true of boys, but like later in life around ages 14 and 15. And the authors thought maybe that had to do with the differences in the timing of puberty. And according to a Gallup survey, by the time kids are in the US are 13, they're spending an average of 4 hours every day on social media.
Okay, Adam, your response?
Well, I don't think you can immediately jump from something is ubiquitous to something is bad. I found a stat that said 41% of 13-year-olds on their 13th birthday had already seen a PG-13 movie. So, these kind of rules that are in place to protect children are broken by children all the time. It's another step to prove that is causing harm in some way. And as I said, I think that the bulk of the evidence just isn't there to prove that.
Showdown, third round.
Round 3, we'll start with Adam. You have 2 minutes to make your point.
I think one of the things that makes this so hard to study is that a lot of these studies are correlational. They're looking at, a snapshot in time, or they're trying to relate different trends. And that means that the results can be confounded. And there's good research to suggest that it's not just that teens that are using social media might see some slight increase in depression or anxiety, but it's that depressed and anxious teens seek out social media. And so those two results are linked in a reverse causation way. So basically, we're seeing that association because teens are seeking it out. So for example, there's been lots of studies that show this, but I found one that looked at depression over time. They followed a cohort of girls. And they found results indicate that social media use did not predict depressive symptoms over time. However, greater depressive symptoms predicted more frequent social media use among adolescent girls. So even if there is a push and pull and maybe social media is nudging people towards anxiety and depression in some specific cases, then it results in this tiny little effect. It's hard to disentangle that from the pressure that's going the other way, that depressed teens are seeking out social media. They're looking for validation or maybe for mental health support, and they're turning to social media. And so we're seeing these numbers where those line up. It just makes it all a lot harder to find good evidence of the effects of social media.
Joss, your response?
I mean, if the longitudinal studies were showing that it just went one way, then yeah, I would concede this point. But I think what they're pretty clearly showing is that this relationship is going both ways. So what we're talking about is basically a feedback loop, which I think should make us more concerned rather than less. So you have kids who may have a predisposition toward depression and anxiety. Maybe it's genetic. Maybe they have stressors that are going on in their lives. We know what kinds of things help those kids, right? Good sleep, being part of a club, being with close friends. But those are also arguably things that are under threat by this shift to spending more time on phones and apps. When we were in high school, 15-year-olds spent an average of 3.5 hours with friends every day. That was me. That has fallen to less than an hour. They're spending a lot more time alone. They're less likely to get 8 hours of sleep. And actually, 45% of teenagers specifically said that social media has harmed their sleep in a Pew poll last year. And when they don't get that support, I think they're more likely to find themselves going down dark, algorithmically driven rabbit holes. Maybe they attach themselves to a sort of shameless media figure that they find online, or they're more likely to engage in sort of antisocial behaviors in these online spaces. So I think that the fact that depressed kids spend more time on social media brings me no comfort at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I just zero in on the one point you made about sleep. I think that there can be reverse causation there as well. There's a study that found that basically kids who are genetically predisposed to be night owls, they end up using more social media because that's when they're at home alone in bed, they're not out with their friends. And so again, you see this correlation between, these people who are sleeping less, they're staying up later, they're getting less sleep because they had got to wake up for high school in the morning. Those people are having, more social media use. But it's because they are predisposed to this that correlation is happening. I'm not saying it's 100%, but I'm just saying that the fact that it goes both ways makes it very hard to say with any confidence what portion of this correlation is due to reverse causation and which portion is due to causation. And that just means that these tiny effects that we're seeing would be even lower if we were able to weed out that reverse causation.
Well, we have time series. They're sleeping less. The kids are sleeping less over time. So it's not like the number of night owls have changed. They're actually less likely to get 8 hours of sleep a night than they used to be.
And if you look at the data for when that degradation of sleep started, it was way back in the 70s that we've had this slow progression downward. And so if you're saying that the mechanism by which social media is causing a mental health crisis is lack of sleep, then why didn't we see these mental health issues slowly rise in concert with that degradation of sleep? It's a more recent thing, and I just don't think that those lines line up in a good way.
Okay, shall we move on? Joss, your next argument, you have 2 minutes to present it.
Adolescent brains are undergoing a significant reorganization. We have to look at the developmental course of a kid. There are basically 2 times in our life where our brain is changing drastically. One when we're a newborn baby, and the other is puberty. And the changes in young adolescents tend to amplify their reactivity to stress, increase their sensitivity to rewards, and it makes them very responsive to feedback from peers. And you can actually measure their self-consciousness on their bodies. There was one study that put people of different ages inside an fMRI machine, and they told them that they were being watched by this camera that was being monitored by a peer of the same gender. There was no camera, but there was this fake camera on, camera off indicator. And they measured their sweaty palms and the activity in a part of their brain that's associated with social and emotional processing. And the response just peaks at age 15. So if you were to pick a time in a kid's life to plug their brain into the bizarro world of social media, 12, 13, 14, 15, they would be the worst times you can pick. At those ages, they're more likely to adopt other people's evaluations of themselves. The likes and feedback that they get are more neurologically rewarding and more likely to shape their behavior. And isolation and rejection are especially damaging. So it's really important for these young adolescents to be interacting with their peers, taking risks, learning from each other, but you really want that to happen through shared experiences, not the kind of asynchronous, superficial social comparison that these apps encourage. And so I think this developmental perspective really helps us understand that if you're going to get this layer of digital social feedback on top of your real life interactions, it shouldn't come right when their brains are being tuned up for social status cues and for self-consciousness.
I think it can help us understand sort of an imagined possibility of what might happen. But, I don't need an fMRI machine to tell me that I was awkward when I was 14 or that I struggled with social, feedback and that sort of thing. That is just, of course, part of being a teenager, being an adolescent, growing up. And I think that it would be wrong to say that social media has exponentially increased those pressures for people. Sure, it's in your pocket, but, in the 1980s, they had burn books. Do you know what those are? The pass-around notebooks that had, anonymous, basically tweets about people in the school. I mean, teenagers have always found a way to be mean to each other and nice to each other, and, all of the complex interactions that happen during that time. And so I think it would, be a mistake to overinflate how much social media is changing that dynamic. And B, I don't think we want to lean too much into invoking neuroscience, because while neuroscience can help us understand this developmental time, and it clearly is so important, the neuroscience research on this specifically hasn't really found anything definitive. They've looked for changes in the brain structure and organization and activation, and they haven't really found something significant. And then at the end of the day, you have to connect those brain changes, if we ever found any, to real changes in people's mental health. And so even if this is a very important period in a child's life, that doesn't mean that harm is happening.
It means that they're most vulnerable during that time, right? I don't think anyone would deny that there are differences in how kids are going to receive the kind of information that they receive on social media if they are 12 years old versus 16 years old versus 18 years old. And I would just ask, would you want to go through high school the way these kids are? Like when I was in high school, if I was going to find out that my friends were hanging out without me, I would have had to like get in my car or have my mom drive me over to their house to like see what other cars were there, or, you know, like you just wouldn't know. And now they always know, right? These kids are posting stories of what they're doing every day, which gives you material to analyze about who is in every single story every single day. Like the volume of information about social cues, the possibilities for misunderstandings and for conflict and drama are overwhelming.
Well, I don't think that it would be a good idea for me, like for us old folks, to like look at this other way of living and say, well, that's not how I wouldn't want to live that way. I think we can just ask the teens how they're feeling. And when you do ask them, a lot of them call it a positive part of their life. You know, there's been surveys where, you know, I think it's 44% say that social media made them feel better. 10% said it made them feel worse. The rest said, doesn't really matter to me. And so I think that, you know, we don't have to imagine like the hellscape that middle school would be right now. We can just ask the middle schoolers, and they say they're doing okay.
In this round, you each get to ask one another a question. Joss, I'll start with you.
In your last video, you said that childhood lead exposure affected adult IQ and had major cascading effects on societies as a result. The effect size on that is small. It's between 0.1 and 0.2. Don't you think that a small effect in studies on social media could have similarly large societal effects when essentially the entire population of young people has been exposed?
Well, I would say that with lead, it's a different story because this is a toxin that we can actually see working in the brain. So we don't have to guess, like, is there something happening in the brain? Is there something happening with mental health? We can look and see, oh, there's lead in this person's brain, and here's what it's doing at a molecular, cellular level. And we can trace that connection all the way up into people's lives. It's been heavily studied. So I'm more confident that a small effect size is real and not just a product of statistical noise.
I think that what you're saying would bias us against things that are hard to study. You know, like, it's true. We don't know, we don't have a neural mechanism for the way that social media could be causing harm, but this is a massive shift in the lives of kids. And I think that we really need to entertain the idea that the harms are harder to capture, but that doesn't mean that they're less real. And the fact that we haven't established a kind of like toxicology to it doesn't mean that we should dismiss it when we see these kids crying out for help.
Okay. Might move on. Adam, your gotcha question.
All right. So my question comes from a specific paper, but I think this is the kind of result that's been found in multiple papers, but I'm just picking this one specifically. It was a longitudinal study where instead of just asking people about their smartphone use, they actually followed exactly every time they picked up the phone, every time they opened an app, how much time they spent on it. So it was much more reliable and granular data than we get from a lot of these surveys. They followed these teens for 12 months. And then at the end of that time, they asked, you know, could we see any relationship between social media use and how people felt? And they found, and I'll quote from the study, we found little evidence that within-person fluctuations in screen time or social media use were associated with increases in negative mood as frequently theorized. So basically, they're looking not at big populations, but just as individual people. If you use more social media, do you feel worse? And they didn't find an effect. How can that be if this is something that's driving a mental health crisis? Why don't we see even a small effect there that might explain, you know, how that could cascade into a crisis?
Well, there's a few things I would need to know about that study. I don't know if it's one of the ones that I read. I need to know how they're defining social media, right?
I can tell you that this did distinguish between screen time and specific, they called social communication apps that would be places where you could send Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat.
Again, I would say we need to look at the gender effects, we need to look at the age effects, and what I'm seeing is that the younger girls are the ones that we need to be worried about. And those are also the ones who are showing up the most at the emergency departments and the suicide rates that are rising the fastest.
In this round, you need to call out a talking point of the other side that you don't like. So, Adam, you'll be up first.
I don't like it when people so easily conflate drug addiction and alcoholism with social media use.
A new addiction has emerged in younger generations, not drugs or alcohol, an addiction to social media.
I just think that we know a lot about how drug addiction works in the brain, and that's just not what we see with social media. And so even if I were to concede that Joss is correct on every one of her points, I still don't think it would be particularly useful to constantly say that social media is like heroin or meth or something that we know is a sort of distinct problem and has a very different way of interacting with our brain. People like to invoke dopamine all over the place. You know, dopamine is sort of this incredible signal that's in our brains that's used for all kinds of stuff. So you can always find a dopamine connection. I just don't think that's a useful thing to pursue.
And Joss, your pet peeve?
So my pet peeve is when I think mostly progressives try to dodge this conversation by saying that minority kids benefit from social media.
Something I have talked about on the show is being worried that if we take social media away from kids, it could make life harder for LGBT kids in particular.
Because they can find other kids who are like them that they might not find in their school community or in their hometown. And when you look at surveys, you do find that Black and Hispanic teenagers spend more time online than their white peers. Gay, bi, and trans kids also log a lot more hours on social media than straight and cis kids. And yes, it's likely that they are able to find connections and representation. But I think that really needs to be weighed against the fact that social media is full of hateful content. And online spaces expose them to racists and bigots who think that they can get away with slurs and harassment because most of the time they can. And so 70% of Black teenagers in the US say that online harassment and bullying are a major problem compared to 46% of white teens. And when you ask Gen Z how social media has impacted their emotional health, LGBT respondents are more likely to say that it's had a negative effect on their emotional health compared to non-LGBT respondents. So I certainly don't see any evidence that social media has been a net positive for teens from marginalized groups. Their mental health outcomes are worse, they're not better. And we need to do the work of making real supportive spaces in the physical world and not assume that they are finding that support online.
That's a fair point.
In the next round, it's time for you each to concede a point. Adam, you can go first.
I think one benefit that this debate has had is that it is a call for us to pay more attention to teens' mental health. And I think that that is something that's really needed. Even if we aren't in an unprecedented mental health crisis, even if we haven't quite figured out what's causing it, I still think we need to understand what is causing anxiety, depression, loneliness in youth and try to help them. And I think that this energy that is currently being pointed towards social media is coming from a really good place, and that is to listen to kids and try to help them.
And Joss, do you have a point to concede?
I do. I would say that I do not think it's particularly useful to go around saying that smartphones or social media have destroyed a generation. The message that they're saying is that like this whole generation is afflicted in a kind of doomery way. And I've seen some studies, really interesting work, suggesting that the mindset that people have about social media can affect their experience of it. And so it's really important for young people and for people like all of us who are trying to figure out how to manage our time on these apps to believe that they have agency and that while these apps are designed to keep them hooked, we can be aware of the techniques that they use to manipulate us and that we can implement changes. So I think it's important not to go around saying that this generation is destroyed and hopeless and depressed and anxious. We're talking about a subset of kids who we really need to be worried about.
Showdown, last round.
You'll each have 1 minute for your closing statements. Adam, you're up first.
It might be true that the hundreds and hundreds of studies, this overwhelming collection of research that we've done so far, hasn't fully captured exactly how social media is affecting teens. But that said, there's no telling what those hypothetical future perfect experiments would reveal. And I don't think that Joss has shown consistent, robust evidence linking social media to this mental health crisis. The evidence just isn't there. Maybe it will be there, but it's not there right now. And so we can't act on this sort of feeling that maybe future studies would reveal something. I think this is an attractive hypothesis because it sort of preys on our desire to judge the way that younger generations spend their time. And it's simple, but really there are more complex solutions that we know will help kids. And if we really want to help kids' mental health, we need to lift them out of poverty. We need to protect them from abuse. We need to provide care for mental health problems no matter where those mental health problems come from. And this discussion is a distraction from those real steps we can take right now with great confidence.
Okay, and Joss, your closing argument?
This is not a situation where we are looking at this new technology and asking, is it safe enough to send our kids into there? They're already in there. It's already happening. And when I think back about how I spent my middle school and high school days, I never had to worry about any goofy or emotional or even ignorant moment being recorded, posted, and shared. I didn't have to think about how my messages could be screenshotted, shared out of context to live forever. I didn't have to think about how I looked in pictures because there were so few of them. But those are just things that are true of being a kid today, no matter how many hours any one of them reports spending on social media in a survey. I do wish that Gen Z and Gen Alpha had the childhood that I did. And maybe every generation says that. But they want that for themselves too. Okay, more than 40% of Gen Zs in the US say that they wish Snapchat and TikTok were never invented. In the UK, more than half of teen girls say they wish they could have been young in a world without the internet. And in the meantime, Mark Zuckerberg wants to give everybody artificial friends projected into headsets as a solution, because after he connected the world online, it turns out more kids are lonely and feeling left out than before.
Who was right? Who was wrong? Who won the fight? Was it Adam Cole or Joss Fong? Go and vote on our Patreon, where we'll discuss what we really thought about this.
Do you want to, on the count of three, say who we think won?
Okay.
1, 2, 3.
Howtown Showdown. We're glad you stuck around so you could get the lowdown. Howtown Showdown. Howtown Showdown.
Get 10% off Riverside at the link below.